Baruchim Abayim, a big warm welcome to all our guests tonight. Before we begin, I would just like to run through with you the order of the evening and give you technical tips on how to make the best of it. My name is Jay Churara from the JCFT Jewish Community Hub. I also look after public relations at the Jewish Rep Council, and I will be your host for this Salford Healthy Communities event. You notice that everyone is muted at the moment. Please stay muted, as the sound is very sensitive on these microphones. If you wish to make a comment or ask a question, please do so on the chat function. Our speakers, when invited to speak, will need to unmute themselves. The event will be recorded and then a public record circulated for those who are not present tonight. You can turn off the camera if you wish. I believe that we may be joined by some people who are anti-vaxxers. The organizing committee's advice is to not engage with anyone who is an anti-vaxxer and to just carry on with the evening. Before we start, I would just like to set the scene for our audience. Post-lockdown has been fraught with numerous stop-starts that is affecting our communal life. Some organizations and schools have resumed various degrees of activity, albeit with many exploring hybrid ways of getting together. However, there is still a significant level, as you know, a significant level of uncertainty as we go into winter. We know that it is imperative to continue following the rules rigorously to speed up the reduction in infection rates until all of us in the community are vaccinated and boosted against all variants. This includes the young as well as the elderly, in the hope that we eradicate this virus soon. We will explore all these topics and more, I'm sure, in the course of the evening. Dear audience, we are upstandingly privileged to have with us this evening a distinguished guest, Professor Alan Silman, our guest speaker, who will share with us the latest developments and update us on vaccinations and answer your questions. So I will introduce our guest, who will give a presentation. We will take questions from Professor Silman, and Dr. Jackie Lewis, chair of the Salford Healthy Communities, will make concluding remarks and give a vote of thanks. And we aim to finish around 9:30 to 10 o'clock. Professor Alan Silman needs no introductions, but here are a few words. Following a graduation as a doctor, he trained in rheumatology. Alan then trained in epidemiology at the London School of Hygiene, working with, amongst others, Professor Michael Marmot. He then took up an academic role in the Department of Epidemiology at the London Hospital. He was appointed as Director of Arthritis Research, UK's Epidemiology Research Centre, Manchester University in 1988, as well as a consultant in rheumatology at MRI. In 2007, he changed role and became the first medical director of the Arthritis Research UK charity. In 2015, he left AR UK to return to academic research in epidemiology and took up the role of Professor of Musculoskeletal Health at Oxford University. He has written a number of books and over 500 scientific articles. Amongst his current roles, he's serving on the national panel reviewing the quality of epidemiological research in UK universities as part of the government's research evaluation framework. Professor, over to you.
Well, thank you, Jay. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you, everybody, I was going to say, for turning out on a cold night like this, but obviously just turning out in front of your screens. I've been giving these sessions, talks and Q&A sessions almost over the past 2 years to a variety of groups, both Jewish and secular. And I never thought that I would be continuing to do one in December 2021. But we are where we are. And I'd like to give you my take on some of the key issues at the moment in regard to the pandemic, and of course to take any questions you have. Now, I want to start off just by emphasizing something which I suspect you're all aware of, but it is worthwhile making this distinction clear. And that is the distinction between the virus's ability to transmit from one person to another, from its ability to cause severe illness, and in some cases, life-threatening illness and sadly, mortality. Before this pandemic, we knew very little about how viruses got transmitted. If you think about it, during a flu pandemic, we never knew who was carrying the flu virus and transmitting it to other people. We only knew about people who got sick. And one of the major advances in medical science and healthcare delivery in this pandemic is the development of mass testing schemes, for example, the lateral flow test that most of us are doing at home from time to time, and also the ability to do the sophisticated PCR testing at levels that were never ever thought possible. In this country, when the pandemic started, we had the capacity to do possibly 500 to 1,000 PCR tests a week in the whole country. And the reason I mention that is we have learnt a lot about the transmission of the virus, which we never knew for any virus before this pandemic. So why is that important? So the first thing to say is our ability to stop the virus being transmitted from one person to another by cough, by sneeze, by laughter, by singing, even in shul, by speech, is very difficult to stop. You can stop it by barrier methods, hence the advice to wear masks. We can stop virus transmission by telling people who we know to be infected not to have contact with other people. We can stop transmission by washing our hands. We can stop transmission by stopping people coming into this country, into a part of the world which is, may have more cases than we have. For example, in Australia, many of the states in Australia, this country, have had boundaries, have had borders stopping people not from, in our case, crossing the English Channel or coming to an airport, but from crossing between New South Wales and Queensland. So these are all steps that can stop transmission. The reason I mention that is that vaccines cannot completely stop transmission. A vaccine cannot stop you being in contact with the virus from somebody else, and that virus landing in the lining of your nose, the lining of your throat, or what have you, and potentially growing, dividing, and causing the infection. What vaccines can do is when the virus starts dividing and multiplying, and entering our cells, the vaccines can stop that. And the vaccines can stop that in two ways. They can stop that by producing antibodies, which are a kind of protein which can bolt onto the virus and stop it doing its work. And the vaccines also stimulate some cells in our bodies called T cells to grow and divide. And these particular T cells from a vaccine will recognize a virus and attack this virus in a multiplicity of ways. And it is not for nothing that these T cells are called killer T cells. So the vaccines cannot stop virus being transmitted from one to another, but they can stop people becoming ill, as can drugs. During the pandemic, the pharmaceutical industry, as well as many research laboratories throughout the world, have said, why can we not stop the virus from multiplying by the development of drugs? Are there examples of drugs that do that in some viruses? Well, the answer is yes. Some of you may have had shingles caused by the herpes virus. And there are drugs that are very effective in shingles. There are drugs that have transformed AIDS, HIV, from being a killer disease into a chronic illness, which, if appropriately treated, can be associated with if not a normal, with certainly a very extended lifespan. In a way, vaccines and drugs are really two sides of the same coin. If you like, a vaccine stimulates our own body to be a factory to produce the agents, the antibodies and T cells that kill the virus. So we are producing our own weapons, if you like. Drugs are providing the weapons outside our body's response. So if you like, vaccines and drugs are two sides of the same coin. So that's a little bit of science to start off with. Second thing you must be asking, why has this pandemic not gone away? We were promised last year, 2020, in March, it will be gone by the summer. Boris Johnson promised us we'd have Christmas. We have been continually promised that this virus would go away, and yet it hasn't. We know currently in the UK, about 1 in 60 people carry the virus. There are 57 boxes on this call tonight, some of which have more than one person. So statistically, one of you will be carrying the virus. 1 in 60 means 1 million people. 1 million people in this country are currently carrying the Delta variant. This is not going away anytime soon. And remember, I said that vaccines and drugs cannot stop the virus passing from one person to another. So this virus is here. It's here in this country, it's here in the States, it's here in many countries in continental Europe. For example, the Netherlands at the moment has got twice the rate of cases that we have in the UK. Why hasn't the virus gone away? Why has the virus proved so capable of withstanding all our ability to control it? And this, in a way, is one of the mysteries, one of the challenges. We know that the virus mutates, and I'm going to come on to that in a minute. So the virus constantly changes. There are many previous pandemics in this country where the virus has mutated to a form that it cannot transmit from one to another. There have been other coronavirus outbreaks. Some of you will remember the SARS pandemic that started in China, I think in 2009. And that we thought was going to spread throughout the world, and it just disappeared. The second point I want to make is just going back to what I said about transmission. This virus can be controlled if we can stop transmission. Now, who knows the truth of what comes out from China? Who knows what to believe and what not to believe? But in a rigorous, centralized, authoritarian state where you can enforce stringent regulations about quarantine and segregation and testing and contact tracing that would be impossible in a free living society, they have been able to control transmission. There are some areas of Europe, in Jena in Germany, they rigidly controlled mask wearing indoors and out of doors. And compared to most other parts of Germany, they've been able to control the virus. New Zealand had a very stringent policy of not allowing anybody in. And the cases of COVID, the predominant number of cases in New Zealand, have been from travelers and not what is called community-acquired infection. And that brings me on to talk about mutations in general and Omicron in particular. And you may have just heard me use the word community-acquired infection. Some of you may have heard on the news today that they've been talking in the UK about cases being community-acquired. What does that mean? It means that the early cases seen of this variant in the UK, as was the case with the Delta variant when it came in from India, could all be traced to either a traveller in or somebody that traveller had been in contact with. There are now cases of Omicron in the UK where they have had no contact, as far as we know, with travellers coming in from South Africa. Why is that worrying? Because that is telling us that Omicron is being transmitted from one person to another. I do not know. We do not know how many cases of Omicron there are in this country. But I can tell you, we can have all the quarantine rules that we would like to stop travellers coming in. And I'm not criticizing the government, I'm just making a scientific point. Based on what happened with Delta, I think that stable door has been locked after the horse has been bolted. I fear that Omicron has been established widely in this country with its ability to transmit possibly 5 times as more frequent as the Delta variant. And we can ask and argue for quarantine and airport restrictions and what have you, but the data would point, and only time will tell us whether this is pessimistic or optimistic, but the data will point to more community-acquired cases of Omicron that actually it's now probably too late to make a major impact by border security. Now, what do we know about Omicron? Well, a lot of you will have read that we know a lot about Omicron because of the substantial and high quality molecular genetic laboratories in South Africa. You know, South Africa comes in for a lot of criticism. I've been to South Africa for medical conferences and working groups over the past few years, obviously not since the pandemic. And I'm very impressed by their quality of the laboratory infrastructure they have. And they identified there was one of the provinces, having had very, very few cases, suddenly had a mini outbreak. And when they looked in detail at the genetic structure of the virus causing this outbreak, they found that this genetic structure was quite different from the other strains that we're used to. And it was different both in the bit of the virus, the so-called spike protein, that attached itself to the body, and also different in other parts as well. And one of the things that the scientists said, when we look at how this virus locks in to the cells in our body, imagine this pen is the virus and my finger. So the way that that virus locks in is quite different in the Omicron to the other variants. And it is ability to enter the cells really quite easily. At the moment, we do not know, we cannot know whether, firstly, this Omicron variant is going to cause people to have more severe infection. My suspicion is probably not, because the virus is not different. The way that the virus causes damage by entering lung cells, taking over the lung cells, genetic machinery, dividing and destroying the cells and causing pneumonia, it shouldn't be a different disease. Is this mutant capable of causing problems in people who have been vaccinated? Well, the vaccination, as I mentioned, is designed that when faced with the virus, the body has got, the vaccine has given the body instructions to supercharge its defenses, supercharging them by making antibodies and supercharging by priming, stimulating, encouraging T cells to kill the virus. Now, we shouldn't remember that the very first strain of this virus was the so-called Chinese or Wuhan strain. And since that strain came in, we have had a large number of mutations. We've had the so-called Brazil, the South African, the British, the Indian, now known as Alpha and Beta and Gamma and Delta and Omicron. But even the Delta variant, which is quite different in its spike protein, in its ability to get into the body, but the vaccines that are in use now, Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, all the main vaccines were all designed based on the Wuhan variant. When the vaccines came out last year, the vaccine manufacturers, and we knew about Delta, they said, we can, if necessary, produce a new vaccine, and we can get it from first thinking about it into the first arm within 100 days. So don't worry, we can do it. But thus far, that has not been necessary for the Wuhan, for the Delta variant. So, although there was concern, considerable concern, that the new variants, Alpha, Beta, and Delta, would be escape the vaccine that had been designed from the Wuhan, the original variant, that has not been the case. So we now have the same anxiety that the vaccines designed for Wuhan may not protect against people getting ill, seriously ill with Omicron. It is not going to stop transmission. It is not going to stop transmission. We will read about cases tomorrow, and if not tomorrow, the next day, and if not the next day, by the weekend, of I have had all my doses of vaccine and I still got infected with Omicron. Those cases will occur. And remember, you first heard it here. But, you know, they will occur. Those cases, because the vaccines did not stop transmission of Delta. They are not going to stop transmission of Omicron for sure. Will the vaccines be sufficiently effective to stop people getting seriously ill? Now, again, there are cases today, yesterday, last month, of people who have had 2 doses. I'm sure there will be people who've had 3 doses of the vaccine who ended up in hospital. But that doesn't mean these 1 or 2 or small handful of cases that these vaccines don't work. The evidence is overwhelming. The evidence is overwhelming that the vaccines are stopping people who have been exposed to and even test positive for the Delta variant. The data are overwhelming that people are not getting sick. Something like they are 95% protective against people getting sick. Well, will this be true for Omicron? Well, we don't know. There have only been 200 cases of Omicron known in the UK. They're rapidly increasing. It is far too soon. Our South African colleagues tell us thus far, people in South Africa have not been getting very sick with Omicron. But actually, they weren't getting very sick with other variants of the virus. And often the people who were getting Omicron, and South Africa is a predominantly young country. So again, I fully expect there will be 1 or 2 cases reported with a lot of publicity of people getting really sick with Omicron despite the vaccine. That does not tell us whether the vaccines are not successful. In order to robustly identify how valuable they are, is going to need many more cases to occur. My guess is, for what it's worth, is the vaccines will prove pretty robust against the Omicron variant. I do want to talk about boosters, but just one thing that you might be interested to know is why people think this variant occurred when it did. And one of the reasons is that mutations happen when the virus replicates, when the virus divides, when it produces more copies of itself. And most mutations happen within an infected person. So, and most mutations are not associated with the virus's ability to live. So the virus isn't very clever, doesn't have a particularly high IQ, and most of the variants that it produces die. Occasionally, if there are a very small number of people who remain sick for a very long time, which gives an opportunity for a virus to build up quite a strong number of mutations within one individual. And that is what is thought to have happened with the Omicron variant. I do want to say a bit about boosters. Now, a vaccine works not by what is in the vaccine now, but by the instructions it gives the body on how to respond when faced with a viral infection in the future. It gives a template. The body has the ability to produce millions of different types of antibodies, millions of different types of T cells, but it's not going to produce them unless it's necessary. Otherwise, we would be overwhelmed. So what the body does is retain the instructions rather than the weapon. It's, if you like, the factory is mothballed until we face the infection. Now, when we have the vaccines, we do produce antibodies in response to the vaccine, and over time they will go down for sure. The hope being that when we are hit with the virus again, very rapidly they will go into production. So the fact that any of us may have had one or two, and I'll come back to booster in a minute, doses of vaccine, and our antibody levels have dropped, might not matter, because what really matters, the real exam, is when faced with the virus, whoom, it goes into production, as does the T cells. Now, when the vaccine manufacturers started work on the vaccine, we had no idea. We had no idea whether we'd need 1, 2, 3, 4 doses or how often. You will all be aware that the annual flu jab is 1 jab. When one of the vaccines started being produced, the vaccine manufactured by the American company Johnson & Johnson, from a Belgian company called Janssen, they thought, and their vaccine is very much like the AstraZeneca vaccine, they said, you know what? We think 1 dose would be enough. So to begin with, we knew that some vaccines, 1 dose seems to be enough. Some of you will know that nowadays, for children with whooping cough, Jackie will correct me, I think, but I think it's maybe 5 doses of whooping cough vaccine, or maybe more, throughout childhood. So there are some vaccines that need to be given on a regular basis. There are some vaccines where 1 dose is enough. We couldn't know what was going to be the case with the COVID vaccines. The scientists could make inspired guesswork from how they worked. They could do laboratory tests. They could look at laboratory animals, ferrets and the like. They could look at cells, but it was only by seeing what happened. And so for the first few months, there was a wait and see. Now, really interesting, when the vaccines first came out, Pfizer said, we think 2 doses 1 month apart. AstraZeneca said, we think 2 doses 1 month apart. And the AstraZeneca vaccine was tested in predominantly, apart from the UK, in Brazil and South Africa. But what happened was there were problems with getting the vaccine, producing it in sufficient quantity and quality. And actually, the AstraZeneca vaccine, by chance, when it was tested in many people 3 months between doses. And so what happened was that actually the data suggested that actually the 1 month from Pfizer might be too short and we should move to 3 months. And when there was a shortage of vaccines last year, you will remember, the NHS said, we're going to move everybody to 3 months to give more people a chance to have their first dose, because the data might suggest waiting 3 months is quite good. So that was, if you like, not something that had been anticipated before the studies started. But what happened so the first people got vaccinated about a year ago, and the second dose started in March, April, May. So over the last few months, there has been the understanding that not only have the antibody levels fallen off, and as I told you, we anticipated they could go back up, but we are aware that more people were getting infected after being vaccinated, and the likelihood of being infected, if not necessarily becoming ill, the likelihood of becoming infected increased with the increasing interval after the second dose. So an arbitrary decision was made. Let's give a booster at 6 months. And the data so far, and they are very minimal, it's far too soon, would suggest that giving a booster at 6 months has brought the immunity level, the level of protection, not only back to what it was, but probably even higher. We do not know whether actually we could have done better if we'd done the third dose at 3 months. Clearly, one of the reasons for moving to 6 months and not waiting for a year is because the pandemic is still with us. I've told you, 1 in 60 people have the infection in Britain. That is phenomenally high. So if the virus had disappeared, as it had done predominantly in early summer, the rates were much lower, there would have been no rush to have produced a booster. We didn't need to. Why would you produce a booster when there's so few cases? So the requirement to have the booster now, at the interval now, was only partly based on the immunology, if you like, but was based on the reality that actually our individual risk of getting infected was not only based on whether we're protected by the vaccine, but by the fact so many people around us are likely to be sick. So if I lived in an area where the virus didn't exist, or was, rate of 1 in 10,000 as it was for some time, I wouldn't have needed a booster. It's only because the virus is so prevalent in the population that we've needed the booster. Are we going to need further boosters? I have no idea. But I can tell you, neither does anybody else. It may be not. Will we need further boosters that are different because of this variant? Maybe, maybe not. The good news is, if maybe, then we can produce the vaccines very quickly. That's all I want to say. And I realize I've been speaking for quite a long time. I know there'll be a number of questions. I just want to say something about childhood vaccination, because I know that's something that people are interested in. When the vaccines were first tested, they were deliberately only tested in people aged over, some of them 17, some were 18. Why? Because this is the way that vaccines are tested for diseases that predominantly affect adults. There's always this challenge in recruiting children for studies with the consent process, etc., etc. COVID is not thought, and quite rightly not thought, to be a serious illness in children. So there was no reason to test the vaccines in childhood. When the vaccines were in widespread use, there have been cases in children. There have been 200 deaths, for example, I believe, in the United States from COVID in childhood, and a large number of children admitted to intensive care. Relative to how many adults is still quite small. But, you know, if this was measles or another disease, people would be up in arms, because we quite rightly are very protective about having a very, very low risk for our children. And so Pfizer was first out of the blocks in testing their vaccine in 12 to 17-year-olds. It does appear to be very safe. There are no particular side effects in children. It's very difficult in that age group, which doesn't get severe disease anyway. And the number of children in the clinical trials was too small to show a benefit of the virus in stopping serious disease, because it doesn't get serious disease, but it does reduce the number of children with an infection. Now, of course, what immunizing children do in the 12 to 17-year-old age group, with a group with a very, very high rates of infection because of mixing at schools, etc., etc., that it reduces the number of people. And as I told you, our risk of developing disease is not only related to our level of immunity, but how many people are around us. So there was a societal view that immunizing children should be useful. Now under discussion is, should we immunize the under 12s, the age 5 to 12? I think the arguments for it are going to be even more based on giving it to children to protect adults, to protect their grandparents. It might be argued there's an advantage in giving it to children so they stop transmission and it doesn't interfere with their education. But as I've said, it's not a given that immunizing children will stop any transmission at all. So perhaps, Jay, I've probably spoken for far too long. I'm sorry if I've gone on, but maybe I'll stop there and take questions.
Professor, thank you. Thank you very much for your informative and illuminating talk and meaningful explanations on a subject that is of concern to all of us. We do have questions, as you might have guessed, and we've got many questions. And as you were expounding on the current situations, I'm sure that people had more questions that they wanted to put in the chat. But we will start with, again, in a funnel type pattern. We will start with the broader questions and then start to focus down. We have over the years experienced viruses like the Ebola, and you did speak about the viruses in China and so on, the Zikas, the avian flu, the SARS 1 and 2, and so on. I was just thinking, prior to that, we used to have a plague once every 100 years or so, but now we seem, to have something, perhaps because of the easy transmission from animals and what have you, every few years, and that is really terrifying in a sense. So Professor, I know that we're not in the guess game, but we do have probabilities and statistics, and able to make statistical models based on data previously to be able to see where we're headed. Could we say with any confidence that we're headed for a scenario where there are more SARS variants coming down the line? I think eventually you've partially answered that, and on a regular basis, and that we will need to always be on the lookout and one vaccination ahead, as it were.
Yeah, well, of course, it's difficult to, it's hard enough coping with the present without predicting the future. I think the worrying thing is where viruses cross species. Because we know that, for example, coronaviruses alone, there are vast numbers of coronaviruses affecting bats and a whole range of other mammals that could cross into humans. So yeah, it is a worry, and I think in some ways maybe this pandemic has been a dress rehearsal for how we as a human race cope with these things. And actually, the truth is, I think we've coped remarkably well. I know I do not want to minimize the impact on individuals and families, but this is a disease which has not decimated human population. It has allowed us to develop some very, very sophisticated ways of testing, as I've mentioned, of producing vaccines for the future. You know, I mean, Sarah Gilbert, who is a much, much more erudite and knowledgeable than I am, would, if she was here, you know, Sarah Gilbert, who was instrumental in developing the Oxford vaccine at the Jenner Institute, I think she would say, absolutely, there will be more zoonotic infections that can cross species that will hit us, but we have got the machinery now to manage that. So yeah, I think the way we organize our healthcare, the way we organize our transport, the way we think about things like wearing masks, these might become every day, and this is our life for the future.
Thank you, Professor. We have received a number of questions from our audience and from the community, and they very much relate to the way we've experienced the COVID virus in the last few weeks and few months from our own viewpoint, and some of the questions are to do with the variants themselves, others are to do with the tests. So one question here asks, when a positive result is sent to the person with the COVID symptoms, how does this person know which variant he has, he or she, the original one, the Delta variant, or the new Omicron? We seem to be going through the Greek alphabet with the variants.
So the answer is that the detailed testing to understand which variant is expensive and relatively labor intensive. So it is not the case that every single sample is tested for every variant. Interestingly, the nature of the Omicron variant is that actually there is a relatively simple test which would suggest whether people have the Omicron or not. But generally, the tests do not do that. The tests are designed to see whether you have a variant of the COVID, any variant of the COVID virus, and it is more sample testing on a regular basis. And clearly, when people are in contact with Omicron and or there's some suspicion, more intensive lab testing is done. But most people are not tested routinely.
Okay, thank you for that comprehensive answer. Someone else from our audience has asked, is it possible to explain why in some households, irrespective of vaccination status, you can get some members of the family catching COVID, whilst others do not, despite being exposed? I mean, I'm sure you've heard that one before, Professor.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Well, I can give you a number of possibilities. Which of them are the true in any particular situation, we can't know. So the first thing is that when we come into contact with a virus, the body has some first-line troops, if you like, that will attempt to get rid of it. And these first-line troops are not like antibodies, which are targeted to a specific virus. These first-line troops will repel any invader, not very efficiently. Indeed, saliva, the mucus we have in our nose, they carry a little bit of defense against infections. We also produce a number of chemicals, if you like, compounds, which again are non-specific, which will fight infection until the proper troops, the antibodies, come into play. So it is entirely possible that the first line troops are stronger in some people than others. They are certainly much stronger in younger people than older people, for example. They're certainly much stronger in people who are not on drugs that weaken the immune system. So your general ability to fight any infection could be one thing. Secondly, who knows how much real contact you've had, whether you breathed in, or who knows, at the same time, whether somebody was coughing out, etc., etc. Thirdly, there is a suspicion, although the data is not very strong, that some people may have a natural immunity to coronavirus from being exposed to other coronaviruses in the past, in particular, some of the viruses that cause the common cold. And indeed, there are some parts of the world, and forgive me, but I think Laos, Laos, might be one of the countries where there is some natural immunity from a previous non-COVID coronavirus. So that would be a third reason. A fourth reason, which again has not come up in the research that's been done, the suspicion was there may be some people who have a genetic background that protects them against being infected if they're exposed. This, of course, is a great theory, but at the moment, if that is true, we don't know what those genes are.
So, thank you very much, Professor. That's very much in keeping with the sort of the theory that says that once we acquire immunity, then that is a good thing generally. But unfortunately, it's not an easy thing to acquire with these viruses. Another question that we have from Karen. My daughter has tested positive in Israel. She has been triple vaccinated. Could you please, Professor, explain to us what effect this could have on her and the baby?
Right. So, well, firstly, to go back to what I was saying at the beginning, vaccination, single, double, triple, quadruple, etc., will not completely stop transmission. It will reduce transmission, and one of the reasons it reduces transmission because when you get ill and you've and with the virus, you are coughing and sneezing, etc., and breathing out, coughing out passing out more virus. So if the vaccines, by stopping people becoming iller when they get ill, will stop them what we call shedding the virus, so the transmission will reduce. It won't disappear completely. The number of cases in Israel is relatively small. I was wondering if I was going to be asked this. If you bear with me one second, yes. I can tell you what's the situation in Israel at the moment. So in Israel, they have been getting around about 500 new cases a day. So, and those are cases that are being picked up. This is where, and yesterday there was one death. So, I mean, the disease in Israel has become much, much less, but 500 cases is 500 cases. And I think if the Israeli government has said, we're not having anybody flying in, we think we've got this disease under control. And one can understand why they've introduced that. In terms of the effects on children, coronavirus is very, very mild, very, very mild in infants, very, very mild in young children. We don't know enough about pregnancy. What we do know is that COVID infection should be avoided in pregnancy because of the risk, particularly to the woman. Pregnancy is a time associated with a reduction in the body's immune defenses. For the reason is you don't want the mother doesn't want to reject the baby, which can be seen as a foreign body, if you like, in an immune sense. COVID can be more serious in pregnancy to affect the health of the woman. It's very little data to show that it harms the unborn baby, although any severe illness in pregnancy where the mother gets seriously infected with a high temperature is clearly not good. But I think it is for this reason that most people would argue that if you really should be vaccinated if you're contemplating getting pregnant.
Thank you, Professor. That was very comprehensive. Our community, the Jewish community, is a microcosm of society in general, and to be really comprehensive, we do have people, as you might have guessed, who may or may not believe in the principle of vaccinations themselves. And some of the questions that we have coming through, and some of the anxieties and concerns that people have, generally speaking, are to do with the vaccinations, the ingredients that are in them, and whether whether fetuses have been used for instance in making them. And one of the questions is, why does it make sense to inject children who are not in danger of the virus? Adults can take vaccines and be protected. What is the scientific justification to give these shots to kids?
Okay. Gosh, there was a few questions there, but I will answer the last question first, and then, if I may, address the other ones. I think it is a reasonable question for society to ask: should we immunize children who are at very low risk of getting a serious infection. I do not say this is necessarily a simple question to answer. I will say three things. Firstly, I think I mentioned that, as far as I'm aware, the data showed that 200 children, young people have died in the United States from coronavirus. Now, if that had been from measles or chickenpox or polio or what have you, there would have been an outcry that 200 deaths is 200 deaths too many. Somebody just said, how many have died from the vaccine? I'm not aware that anyone has died, any child has died from the vaccine. The second thing is that is there...
Have you checked the VAERS database, sir?
Sorry?
Did you check the VAERS database before you said no children were harmed by the vaccine?
Can I come back? Can I come back to that?
Yeah,
okay.
Could you please stay muted unless you're invited to speak?
Yeah, I will. I'm not afraid of addressing the question, honestly. There is the issue as the reason why the pandemic has been allowed to continue at the level it has, with 1 million people in this country currently being infected, is because of this virus spreading through particularly teenage children. And I think society can ask the question, and I take the point about vaccines, whether they're doing harm, but let's play the mind game that vaccines are perfectly safe. And if vaccines are perfectly safe, and society has said we are prepared to pay the economic cost, which is relatively small, and this would provide a means of substantially reducing the community transmission of this vaccine, then there is a philosophical argument. This isn't an epidemiological argument. It's a philosophical argument, I believe, that would say it is justifiable. It is justifiable for children to be vaccinated and for society to ask that of children, for children to be presented with the facts and to make up their own mind. So I think that is a reasonable question. Now, of course, the issue is, but how do we know these vaccines are safe? It is impossible. It's impossible to prove a negative. For example, if somebody was to say to me, how do I know that if 1 in a million children will not get multiple sclerosis 5 years' time from the vaccine? I can see, I'm just putting that out of the hat. There is no reason why a vaccine should give you multiple sclerosis, but, a biologist could come up with a cogent argument why it could possibly lead to that. But with at that rate of side effects, I cannot prove it. The vaccines have been robustly tested by Pfizer in several thousand children, predominantly in the United States, and in the thousands that have been tested, there have been no serious side effects. The problem is that, of course, the more children who are vaccinated, by chance alone, a child 5 days after getting vaccinated may start with some illness, and who knows whether it's because of or in spite of the vaccination. But I will go back to the data we have, predominantly from the United States and also from the UK. This disease is not totally an asymptomatic disease in childhood. There have been, I could check that out, but I think there have been 200 child deaths from COVID in the United States. So balancing a known versus an unknown, for me, I think I can see the argument. I think, to me, I would, be happy to support vaccination for 12 to 17-year-olds. For 5 to 12-year-olds, it's difficult, and I don't know the answer. Sorry.
Professor, we have a question very much about the topic that we were just discussing now, and that is one reason for vaccinating children is to prevent the debilitating condition of long COVID. What does the professor think of this consideration?
Yeah, it is very, very difficult. And long COVID is a very strange condition. We don't know much about it. We call anybody who has prolonged symptoms as having long COVID. But what it is and what causes it, we really don't know. There are some people whose symptoms, shortness of breath, tiredness, what have you, last for a few weeks. There are others who last for a year. As far as we know, long COVID is related to the severity of the infection. The worse COVID you have, the worse or the greater the chances that you will get long COVID. It's I think that while I was answering the question, I was just looking up. I can tell you from the UK, there have been 25 child deaths between March 2020 and February 2021. So if they'd continued at the same level, that'd probably be about, I suspect now, maybe about 50. So my figure of 200 in the USA is probably correct. I don't think the answer is we don't really know about long COVID in children. I mean, there's an interesting parallel here. One, if you like, medical model from long COVID is what we used to call glandular fever or infectious mononucleosis. This is a very common teenage and student childhood disease. When I was at university, they used to call it the kissing disease for reasons that I guess are fairly obvious. And one of the things we know about that condition is the debilitating fatigue that can cause for months afterwards. So we don't have the robust data, but it would not surprise me that children who developed substantial symptomatic infection could develop prolonged fatigue.
So thank you, Professor. We have looked so far at the disease. We've looked at its manifestations. We've looked a little bit at prevention and the vaccines, and looking at the management of the disease. There's a question we have here. There's a COVID pill, and I will try and pronounce it. It's molnupiravir, I think it's called. If someone catches COVID, how might they know if they are eligible, and will they be able to get it through their GP? This is from Jackie.
Okay. So, well, thanks for that question. It's molnupiravir.
Right.
It is a drug that is being produced by the American drug company Merck. It's not a new drug. It has worked in against other coronaviruses in the past. And there's a US biotech company. They found that ferrets apparently are a very good model for COVID-19. And this molnupiravir was very good at stopping the virus replicating in ferrets. Now, I have to say, we have not seen the full data in a scientific publication. We've only seen the press release from Merck that came out a couple of weeks ago. But the MHRA, the drug regulator in the UK, was sufficiently impressed that they've licensed the use of molnupiravir, and the British government have bought 500,000 doses. Now, what the data showed, that if you take one capsule twice a day for 5 days, you halved the rate of people who needed to be in hospital. So in the study that they looked at people who had not asymptomatic infection, but were ill, a little bit ill, but also the people they tested on were people who had other risk factors. So they were diabetic or obese or had respiratory disease or something. So these were people who were likely to get sick. And indeed, without the drug, about 1 in 7 of them got sick to be submitted to hospital. And with the drug, it was about 1 in 14. And about 1 in 50 of these group of people who weren't on the molnupiravir died, and nobody in the active drug. So these were really quite impressive. We haven't seen the full data, relatively small number. Again, we don't know about side effects, but it's also very expensive. But if this drug was infinitely cheap and we absolutely knew it was safe, then in theory, everybody could take it when they tested positive. 2 tablets a day, even buy it over the counter, and it could be quite useful. There's another drug that came out from Pfizer, which called Paxlovid, Paxlovid. It's actually 2 drugs. One of the drugs has been used to treat people with HIV. And another, it was specifically designed for COVID, so the 2 drugs working together. And their results were very impressive. 7%, 1 in 14 of their group that had the inactive group needed hospitalization, compared to only 1% of the Paxlovid group. And indeed, the trial was so impressive that the Pfizer had to stop the trial because it was thought unethical to continue. So we do have 2 drugs, possibly, that we could get over the counter when we're sick to stop the disease in its tracks. But at the moment, we don't have enough data to make sure that the side effects are not going to be worse than the disease, because most people would not end up being hospitalized. So we need more data before these drugs, but these are therapeutic advances, to be sure.
So thank you, Professor. I mean, this is really reassuring, obviously, with the data coming through and with the trials and the clinical trials and everything else with it, for us to be able to start to look forward to this hope of having something that we can take when someone tests positive. We all remember the horrible, terrifying images that we've seen last year of people gasping for oxygen and on oxygen machines and so on. We have one further question coming in about pregnant women. We all remember the MMR vaccines and that period. So the question is, what stage is best to give the vaccine at what stage of pregnancy, and what advice to give to pregnant women about other misinformation?
Yeah. I think, you know, the NHS advice, and I've got on their website here, it says, if you, and I quote, if you're pregnant and have not had a COVID-19 vaccine yet, you should be vaccinated, preferable for you to have the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine, because the AstraZeneca vaccine hasn't been tested in pregnancy. The Pfizer and Moderna have been tested in women who are pregnant, and there have been no concerns. So, yeah.
Why did you tell us that there was a 82% miscarriage rate in the Pfizer tests? Why don't you tell us that's what happened in the first 3 months of pregnancy?
That's actually not true.
It is true. Look it up yourself.
Thank you. I have, and it isn't true. I'm sorry.
Could you please stay muted unless invited? Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Carry on.
Yeah, you really have to be very aware. I mean, unfortunately, these days, with the way that research is being published, what's happening is people are doing research not just on this, but on so many areas, and it gets into the public domain without being checked for research quality. We have to be aware that miscarriage is a very common consequence in normal pregnancy. In fact, it's really quite difficult to know how common miscarriage is. It is very difficult to do the robust studies, and it can only be done in randomized studies to show that the vaccine is associated with an increased rate of miscarriage. And I have to say to the caller that those studies have not been done. I'm not carrying any baggage. I'm just giving you the scientific data that there is no proof that the Pfizer vaccine, or indeed any vaccine, would cause miscarriage. And indeed, more importantly, there is no reason at all biologically why these vaccines should cause miscarriage.
Okay, so thank you, Professor. We will have one more question before we invite the audience to participate if they wish. If someone wishes to ask a question, please could you put your virtual hand up, and then you will be invited to speak, and we will take questions that way. The final question, Professor, is with regards to lateral flow tests versus PCR tests, and which is best, and this whole area of false positives and so on. Is there any preference for people as to which test to take and how often, and so on?
Well, the tests are actually quite different, and they're doing different jobs. And without getting technical, the PCR test is more sensitive in terms of showing whether you have viral particles. But it doesn't mean to say that the virus you have is capable of causing an infection. So you can be positive on the PCR, but it doesn't mean to say that you're infectious. So, and the lateral flow test may not always be positive, but it's more likely to show that you have an active infection.
Okay, thank you for that, Professor. That makes perfect sense. I can see a hand up by Yossi. Please unmute yourself and ask the question.
I just want to, you know, I've been challenged by somebody here, and I think misinformation is really so important about this story of miscarriage and COVID. There was a research article in the New England Journal of Medicine on November the 18th this year, which is about 3 weeks ago. The New England Journal of Medicine is the premier research medical journal in the world, perhaps jointly with the Lancet. And they studied 14,000 women with pregnantly, 5.5% who'd been vaccinated, and the rate of miscarriage amongst women who was vaccinated was 90% of the rate in those who had not been vaccinated. So, and I can send your listener this article, but this is by far the most robust data. And these authors from Norway, the Scandinavian countries, have got by far the best population-wide data. And I quote, "Our study found no evidence of an increased risk for early pregnancy loss after COVID-19 vaccination. And as to the findings from other reports supporting COVID-19 vaccination during pregnancy, and I think the risk to a pregnant woman of being vaccinated to her health and her life as such that it would be negligent not to advise vaccination during pregnancy."
Thank you, Professor, for that reassurance. Yossi, please put your question to the Professor respectfully.
Just thank you, Professor, for your time. One thing I've noticed is that many of the questions that Jay was asking, your answers are quite hesitant. Is that we're not sure about the data, we're not sure about a lot of uncertainty around the experience of the data, but then everyone's very sure about taking a vaccine. If we're unsure because it's a new virus and the new variants and unsure how they're spreading or what the response is going to be, how the body's going to react to it, why are we so certain about a vaccine? Why can't we be more cautious? Why can't we have other opinions? Why can't other treatments be explored? Why is it seem to be a singular point of treatment, of prevention of a vaccine, when most of the reason for it is always preventative? It's always, we don't know, it might not be.
So I think, well, epidemiologists like me are by inclination cautious. I do not know, I cannot tell you what the protection the vaccines are going to give 2 years after people have been vaccinated, because we've not had 2 years of data. I cannot tell you whether there is if we vaccinate the entire population of Great Britain, which is what, 65, 67 million, if you were to tell me if there is a risk of a disease like multiple sclerosis or I don't know, what have you, Parkinson's disease, of 1 in a million occurring in the 3 years following vaccination, I could not tell you whether that could or couldn't happen, because we haven't got the numbers and we haven't got the data. That's not being cautious. That's just stating the obvious. We can, I think it's important that we keep within the data we have. And if we don't keep within the data we have, then the public will not trust us. If I was to stand up at this meeting, or colleagues to say, I know for sure that this vaccine is 100% successful and 100% safe, that would be untrue and people would not have confidence. What I am absolutely convinced of, and there is no hesitancy here, that this is a disease whose consequences are infinitely worse than the consequences of being vaccinated, as far as any data we have. And if people want to play Russian roulette because of fears about something that we don't know, and we don't know now the direction in the future, that's fine. But there are such solid data about the benefits of vaccine within the confines of what's reported. And we just need to keep within those. every single scientific paper I have ever written has always ended up, and it doesn't matter whatever it's on, you know, we need to check these results. We constantly need to keep diseases and their treatments and their prevention under surveillance. And I think we should beware of anybody who says, I know all the answers now for all time. None of us have that wisdom.
Thank you, Professor. Our next caller is Tanya. Tanya, please unmute yourself and put your question.
Hi, Professor. Thank you very much. It's been very informative as always, and stimulating. So thank you for all the valuable information you've given. Professor Silman, you touched on, I think it was antibodies and immunity, the ones who are sort of more at risk, such as those who are seriously clinically vulnerable, who are suffering diabetes or has respiratory diseases. How much? What would you say the risks are? Are there any more risks to them than there were with the Delta or any other of the variants? And what do you think we should be doing at the moment? Are we not getting to the stage of shielding again, are we? And should any, if we do go out amongst people, especially with, you know, coming up to maybe meeting family during the holidays, should we be asking other people to be taking lateral flows?
That's a great question, Tanya. We do know. I mean, the trouble is the range of vulnerabilities is quite large. And so from people who have very substantial immunity problems, like, you know, people who've had a kidney transplant and been on anti-rejection drugs at one end, if you like, and say a diabetic at the other, whereas somebody who's on anti-rejection drugs that really will influence their immune response, and the vaccines may not be so successful, clearly they would need to reduce contact with people. And yes, as you suggest, family members do a lateral flow test, wear masks, you know, ventilation, etc. At the other end of the spectrum, somebody who maybe has diabetes or a bit of underlying chest disease, I think you can tailor that risk according to it. So there isn't a one size fits all.
Thank you, Professor. We have one more, our last questioner, our last caller, and that is Yehuda. Yehuda, could you put your question to the professor, please, respectfully?
Yeah, of course. Excuse me. Thank you very, very much, Jay, and thank you, Professor. Really, really appreciate the talk tonight. Thank you very, very much for taking the time to speak to us. It's obviously a very, very broad topic with lots and lots of information that you know, I need to learn. So I want to ask you, I went on the Office for National Scottish Statistics earlier in the evening, and it appears that about 90% of the people who've died since September in hospital have been vaccinated, and only about 10 to 15% of the people who've died in Scottish hospitals haven't been vaccinated since September. Leading up to September, it was more or less the other way around. The reason I went on the Scottish website is because they have to report deaths to the, I forget what it's, provocateur someone or other, but within 8 days. That's the one. Thank you. It's a bit Latin for me. It takes a lot longer for the information to come out in England. So, you know, I've not yet been vaccinated myself, but my father, he's elderly and he's got dementia. So I took him for his booster shot 2 weeks ago. So obviously, you know, I do believe very, very strongly in informed choice, etc. I just want to ask, you know, specifically about the children, because they are not in danger. You know, the CDC said 99.98% of children are not in danger from COVID. And because adults can be protected by the vaccines, which are readily available now to pretty much anybody, you know, should I vaccinate my children?
Okay, So you heard, can I just say there's two parts to your question. The first part's an interesting one, which is that the deaths that are happening with COVID are people who've been vaccinated. In a way, if we are in a world, and the Israelis found this, of course, that if we are in a world where everybody's been vaccinated, but the disease is still happening, then, you know, as night follows day, anybody who dies will have been vaccinated. Like anybody who dies will have had breakfast, or, you know. And so the question is not how many deaths occurred in vaccinated people. What might have been the number of deaths if people hadn't been vaccinated? But, you know, in a world where everybody's been vaccinated, we have to expect, particularly if they are vulnerable people in some ways, that, you know, that will happen. So that's a kind of statistical thing we need to be aware of. I'm not sure I can add much to what I've said already about children. I can't dismiss the argument, and I wouldn't, and I hope people aren't going to believe I have, about this issue of benefits and risks of vaccination in childhood. And it is a complex one. And as I say, I think it becomes one of altruism and philosophy rather than of public health. Maybe that's the place to stop.
Thank you, Professor. I'm sure it was. Professor, and I'm sure the audience will back me up on this. This is a topic that we could talk about all night. I'm sure we just started, and we started the conversation not for ourselves, but also for the community and society in general. But unfortunately, we can't sit and talk about this topic all night. So we will have to draw to a close. And I will invite the chair of Salford Healthy Communities, Jackie Lewis, to do some concluding remarks and a vote of thanks. Jackie.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you, Jay, for your excellent chairing this evening. Professor Silman, as Jay said, we're just so very lucky to have you supporting our events and to have your expertise available to us. We are just extremely grateful. You've dealt with all the questions with given great detail. You've been patient with our audience. You've got some fantastic phrases. I like that you say that the vaccine supercharges our defenses, and you've reminded us that the virus really hasn't gone away at the present time, that still the rates are high in the community, and that we all need to be aware and continue to take efforts to protect ourselves. So, as Jay said, we are just outstandingly privileged to have your help tonight, and for the previous talks you've given us also. Each time you come up with new information, new ways of clarifying this difficult topic, and just making it so much more understandable. Thank you so much. So I think we are wrapping up the evening. We're very grateful for everybody who's attended tonight. I hope you've all found it very enlightening, and we look forward to having you return to our events. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for the grotesque misinformation. Goodbye.
Apologies, that we knew that there would be some people attending tonight who had some interesting views, some diverse views.
These are views which are actually on